Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today at our market briefing, which is looking at these wonderful pieces of legislation that our great regulator likes to pass down to us from time to time. Unfortunately, they seem to be doing more of recent than past. I'm quite pleased, actually. Immediately to my left, I've got John Needham, and beyond there, we've got Paul Goldwyn. John and I go back more years than I wish to recall. Whilst they do work for accountancy firms, they're very, very knowledgeable with regard to all things regulatory. And recently John and I were talking about the IDD and how that's going to impact upon our lives as we go forward. A lot of people are concentrating on certain elements, but there are other elements within there that we really do need to get a grip with. And some of that will actually relate, I think, to actually holding the correct data. Only last week I was with two of my board members at the FCA, and we were discussing with the FSCS, that lovely company called Enterprise Insurance Company. They've been playing with that for the last 12 months, for the simple reason is that the insurance company didn't know who the policyholders were, which frightened the socks off of us. So if you look at it, it's going to a sub-broker, it's going to a broker, it's going to an MGA, and the insurer is not getting that data. And they are really, really concerned about that. So they're really beginning to dig in. Now, whilst it may not particularly impact on the IDD, transparency is very much on their agenda. So please be very, very careful on that. But I'm sure the good people in this room and those upstairs in the gallery won't actually be doing that. You'll have all the data. So it started off, John's going to start off and then hand over to Paul, and then Paul will probably hand back to John. We'll have time for Q&A after, but please write them down. John, would you be happy if they interjected whilst you're going through? Yep, there you go, your options. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John Needham and Paul Goldwyn.
Thanks, Peter. You held back on any interesting stories, so that's good. Thank you all for sparing your lunch times as well. Always grateful when we've potentially got some tricky subjects to talk about. I think there's a few people in the room that came to our seminar a couple of weeks ago where it was more based around the wholesale market review that was going on, and I took a bit of a negative tone on that one, so I'm going to try and get a bit more positive about this and how businesses can actually take what's in the IDD, take what's going on in the wholesale review, and actually turn it into something a bit more positive around engagement with your customers and transparency, etc. So, what are we going to cover? What is the IDD? What are we actually talking about? Can I have a quick show of hands for people who've gone through any of the consultation papers on the IDD? Okay, all right. So we've got some, hopefully that makes it more interesting and worthwhile being here. I want to talk about how the IDD links with other FCA activity that's going on at the moment. Obviously, Peter's mentioned things like Enterprise. We've got the wholesale review. We'll see how those tie together. We'll go through some of the key elements of the IDD that may impact on you as MGAs. I think we've probably got a few insurers in the room, so obviously it has an immediate impact on you. And then we'll talk through how we can deal with some of those issues that are being raised right now, even though the IDD hasn't yet come through. So, what is the IDD? It's the Insurance Distribution Directive. I guess it's pretty obvious. In looking through, you can just see this huge emphasis coming through, and it's, the name's in the title, distribution. The key focus of the IDD is how the insurance market tackles dealing with customers. So it's not necessarily just the distribution of products, it's the design of products, it's remuneration, etc. We'll come on to the contents in a minute. It's the replacement of the IMD. So that's been around since 2004, probably earlier. Peter will correct me if I give some specific dates. But there's a wide-ranging changes coming across, affects all brokers across Europe. Again, we're on a level playing field, and it's coming in 1st of October this year. So there's been a significant delay from 1st of February when it was due to come in, and it's been pushed out to 1st of October 18. So there's an extension, but there's still not a whole load of time before it comes in. And I think one of the key messages we'll come on to at the end is actually engaging with it and understanding how it impacts on your business. There's potentially a fair amount of thinking to do about your business model. The other thing it does is align with MiFID II. That's come out on the investment management world. And a huge focus of MiFID II was about customers, dealing with customers, transparency, remuneration, all of these topics that the IDD covers. It's no coincidence that it aligns very much with MiFID. And certainly some of the issues that the FCA observed, I suppose, in developing MiFID II impact heavily on the IDD. So what's going on at the moment? We've got a huge amount of activity going on, driven by Europe, driven by the FCA. We've got the wholesale market review, which is ongoing. I think the last submissions for that went in 2 or 3 weeks ago. We're expecting an outcome of that maybe towards the end of the year, maybe a bit later than that. There's quite a handy summary of exactly what that review is about. I've taken this straight from the FCA's business plan for 18 and 19. And I guess the key words to me in here were, they're assessing whether brokers are using their bargaining power to get clients a good deal. That's in summary what they're looking at. And actually that can translate directly across to some of the themes in the IDD. What structures are in the market ensuring that a client gets a good deal or not? Are the customers getting the best outcomes? We'll come on to that in a second. The one key thing to me is that if the FCA take a negative view of what the outcomes, I suppose, of the wholesale review, and they conclude that brokers aren't using their bargaining power to get clients a good deal, that could have a knock-on impact on the rest of the market, in that if there's conflicts found, if there's remuneration structures found that they're not comfortable with, we could effectively see a wholesale market review too, which will extend out to the rest of the market, which will include MGAs and possibly other retail brokers. So, on a more positive note, if we go through all of the things that we'll talk about today on the IDD, if they are successfully implemented, considered, and the FCA can conclude that, the market can handle the IDD and takes on board all the principles, maybe there's not a need for another wholesale review or a different style of review around remuneration, because it links directly to the themes that are embedded within the wholesale review. That'll become clearer later on as we talk through the key themes. I guess I would say on the wholesale review is we can see comparisons with, say, the stockbroking market, the investment market, where there's 2 examples there where effectively bundled services, i.e. a commission element and a services element, are effectively split out, and those providers aren't able to bundle services anymore. So that's certainly a similar kind of structure to what we've got going on at the larger end of the wholesale market, where we've got services and we've got commissions bundled, potentially. It's clear that the FCA aren't comfortable with that, as we've seen in other markets. So I think the key message from that is you keep a real eye open to what's going on in the wholesale market review, irrespective of where you sit within the chain, where you sit within the market. I think the other thing that's going on immediately is the senior managers and certification regime, again, putting much more focus on customer outcomes and alignment of competencies within the business and customer outcome. So these all fit together in the same kind of overview of transparency, customer outcome, remuneration, conflicts, which we'll cover a bit more. So one of the key things that Peter and I were talking about was, well, we've got the IDD. On the face of it, it's talking about customers. And you think, okay, well, we're talking about the end insured here. As MGAs, we're one step removed from that. As a wholesale broker, we're one step removed from the end customer. So are we in a position where there's less onus on MGAs to really understand the detail of the IDD? Well, the answer is no. There's still that need to really understand what's going on. And in fact, there are specific references within the IDD to the wholesale market and the need to understand, the need to consider the end customer, i.e. the insured, even though we're one step removed. So it's specifically in there talking about that. We'll come on to some other aspects later when we're talking about product manufacturers, and the need for MGAs to consider that. But I guess the key thing for you as well, even if we're not a product manufacturer, is really understanding the knock-on impact of IDD on the rest of the market. So we'll see later on, retail brokers may be demanding new communication styles, new information from you as an MGA or as an insurer. You may have the need to identify conflicts of interest within your business. There's a different style on identifying conflicts of interest, which are highlighted by the IDD. We've got business structures, funding structures, again, a need to review that to make sure that we haven't got anything that's conflicting with the fundamental principles of IDD. And also, as Paul will talk about, there's very clear guidelines on remuneration structures, both within the business and for individuals, again, which as MGAs you'll be required to consider and comply with. So there's a lot in there, and there's a lot that does apply directly to MGAs. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to Paul. We're going to go through three of the key topics that we think kind of have the potential to really impact on the business. Paul, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Paul Goldwyn from PKF Littlejohn. I'm going to talk about two of the three main concepts that John has outlined. The first one is the issue of customers' best interest. And just to give you a little bit of background, I mean, this is by no means a new subject. Better put my glasses on first. The concept of customers' best interest originally arose in the precursor to the IDD, which was IMD2, where one of the overarching objectives was that of consumer/customer protection. I think what the IDD is trying to do here, again, as I think John alluded to, is to align the current customer protections with those already in MiFID. And as I'm sure you all know, the FCA has had 3 consultation papers regarding IDD implementation. The one that we're going to focus on is the first one, CP 17.7, which was in March 17. And the FCA has said very clearly what they're trying to do here is they're trying to incorporate the IDD principles within the current ICOB rules, and particularly around the whole area of customers' best interests, and trying to elevate the concept of customers' best interests. The IDD introduces 3 main general principles which apply to all sort of insurance distributors, and you'll see this common sort of title of distributors coming along in the various sort of references, which basically means that it's not just the retail intermediary which is affected by the IDD, it's the entire sort of distribution chain. And these general principles are very sort of similar to the FCA's current principles for business. The first one is, I think, the one that really encapsulates the IDD, is that distributors must act honestly, fairly and professionally in the best interests of the customers, and that's a theme that that we'll see time and time again. They must communicate in a way which is clear, fair and not misleading, and also very interestingly, and running in parallel with the current work of the FCA and the Wholesale Market Review, is that the distributors' remuneration and their performance management practices must not conflict with their duty to act in the customer's best interests. So in terms of the CP 17.7, the first consultation paper, as I said earlier, the idea here is to incorporate the IDD general principles within ICOBs. The FCA are also looking at basically amending ICOBs to emphasise more clarity in communication, particularly in the pre-contract disclosure and in marketing material. And they're also looking to introduce a new rule within CISC prohibiting remuneration and performance management practices that conflict with this term of customer's best interest. And they intend to apply these general principles, as I said earlier, to the entire distribution chain. So they won't just affect the retail intermediaries who actually deal with the end customer. It's been extended out to wholesale intermediaries, to MGAs, to aggregators, and to authorised firms who are basically distributing through this new term of the ancillary insurance intermediary, which is basically an entity that doesn't have insurance as its core activity, such as a travel agent or a motor dealer, etc. So the FCA sent out their consultation paper. They requested feedback. Generally, the feedback was good. It was well received. It was perceived to reflect things which the respondents deemed to be good practice, expected of quality firms. There were some comments, of course. There was comments around whether the whole issue of the implementation of the IDD was necessary given the existing FCA principles for business. There were comments around whether the rules could be deemed to be too broad and too open to interpretation, particularly the rule around the prohibition of remuneration and performance management practices which conflict with the customer's best interest. Interesting question was whether this whole issue of customer best interests conflicts with the firm's responsibility to act in the best interest of their own shareholders. But perhaps the main area of consultation and the main area of feedback was the whole question of does it really apply to wholesale intermediaries given that they have no direct contact with the end customer. And the FCA came back, I felt, quite succinctly in response to those particular queries regarding the issue of are these rules really relevant given the principles of business. They, within the consultation paper, they've tried to elevate this whole issue of customers' best interest. I mean, they refer to Principle 6 of their Principles for Business, where it actually say that firms need to pay due regard to customers' interests, but they've actually kind of said, well, that's one level of basically paying regard to customers' interests. We now require firms to actually act in the customer's best interest. So they feel that the implementation of the IDD has kind of elevated that. They're currently not quite there when it comes to proper definition of this requirement to ensure that remuneration practices, performance management practices, do not conflict with customers' best interest. They're still seeking guidance on that because they want to ensure that when they do sort of give their guidance, it's clear and it's consistent across the entire market. And in terms of wholesale insurance intermediaries and whether they're really affected, I mean, they went to a fair bit of detail in terms of saying that they kind of appreciate that the wholesale intermediaries are not in direct contact with the customer during the sales process. They understand that. And in particular, if you look at the definition of a customer, it's defined as the policyholder or the prospective policyholder. But they've said that nevertheless, they kind of expect the wholesale intermediary to rely on the information that is being provided by the retail broker in the chain in making sure that they are acting in accordance with customers' best interest. And irrespective of where they lie within the chain, they will still need to comply with the IDD. So that's customers' best interests. I want to move on to remuneration disclosure now, because the IDD introduces new requirements for pre-contract disclosure of information about a distributor's remuneration. The insurance intermediaries must disclose the nature and basis of the remuneration that they receive in relation to an insurance contract. The IDD states that in respect of fee business, it's the amount of the remuneration that must be disclosed. If for whatever reason at the pre-contract stage the fee can't actually be ascertained, can't be quantified, they've got to actually disclose the method of calculation. In respect of non-fee business, it doesn't need to be the actual amount that's disclosed, just the actual method of calculation. And the IDD sets out some very clear guidance on how this information must be provided in policy documentation. It's got to be clear, accurate, comprehensible. It's got to be in the official language of the relevant member state. It's got to be provided free of charge. It's got to be provided in either paper or electronic format, such as via a website. But if it is via a website, the paper option must also be available and be free of charge. And it cannot just be sort of communicated orally. It's got to be in some sort of written format. So again, the FCA consulted in this in their first consultation paper, CP 17.7. That consultation paper actually clarified quite a bit of the rules around the proposed IDD rules on remuneration disclosure. They kind of clarified that by nature, they referred to the type of remuneration, i.e. be it commission, brokerage, bonus, profit commission, or whatever. And they also clarified that by basis, they meant the actual source of the remuneration, i.e. a commission derived from a premium, a fee payable by a customer, etc., etc. And they also clarified that the information disclosed must actually be in respect of the insurance contract that was being sold at that point in time. And also in disclosing this information, they emphasised that firms must be mindful of the whole issue of clarity to customers in actually trying to show the relationship between the firms in the distribution chain and highlighting any potential conflicts of interest. And for those of you who are aware or familiar with the ICOB rules, the current rule in ICOB 4.4, which basically states that where a commercial customer requests it, you need to actually disclose the amount of commission earned. That actually is totally unaffected by the IDD and the FCA proposals. That stays very much as it is. I want to take you through some examples which are actually set out in the consultation paper of what they would deem to be compliant disclosure and non-compliant disclosure. The first scenario is, a typical sort of brokerage commission arrangement whereby you'd say something on the lines of, we arrange a policy with the insurer on your behalf, you don't pay us a fee for doing this, we receive a commission from the insurer, which is a percentage of the total annual premium. The FCA deemed that this would be a compliant form of disclosure because it gives some information about the type of the remuneration, i.e. the commission, and it also explains the source of the remuneration, so it clearly states that it's calculated as a percentage of the total annual premium. If you compare this to the second one, this is certainly more bland and vague. It merely says that the commission is received from the insurer for selling this policy, but it doesn't actually give any information per se about the source of the commission, so that wouldn't be enough. That would not be compliant. So in terms of the feedback and consultation on remuneration disclosure, again, the FCA felt that the feedback that they received was sufficiently robust for them to be able to go ahead with their plans to actually implement this. In terms of the actual specific feedback that came back, there was concern about information overload, customers getting too much information, and whether the customer really cares. At the end of the day, we all know that customers will only really care if something goes wrong. And the FCA were mindful of the fact that customers have been receiving a lot of information in policy documentation, etc. But they kind of felt that what they are proposing to implement are the very minimum requirements of the IDD, so they're going ahead irrespective. There was also some query as to providing a bit more clarity on the rules as to whether the intermediaries would need to disclose the remuneration of all the parties within the chain when disclosing that remuneration details in the policy documentation. And they actually said that at that stage that wouldn't be required. It would only be the specific remuneration of the actual intermediary. So that's all from me for the moment. I'm going to hand back to John. He's going to look at product governance and then wrap up the session.
That's great. Thanks, Paul. So, it's quite interesting just looking in terms of the remuneration structures. You can see the level of detail that the FCA are going into. Paul gave the example wordings of remuneration structures. There's actually there's lots of examples in the consultation paper of different types of structures. So it's kind of good news that the FCA have actually got hold of the remuneration structures that are in place and have articulated what they would expect to see in disclosure to clients. So it's definitely worth a read through those. One of the, I guess, key things that could impact on MGAs is product governance. And there's this new concept, we mentioned it earlier, of a product manufacturer and a distributor. So a distributor is limited to effectively the distribution of products, and it defines effectively the regulated activity that those entities are carrying out. And then on the other hand, we have a product manufacturer who's actually designing insurance products. So as a default, all carriers are classified as a product manufacturer. And then it goes on to say, we will then extend that out to other people in the market who are carrying out product manufacture. And of course, that leads you to a first decision as an MGA. Are we a distributor only, or are we a product manufacturer? We'll come on to what that means in a little while, but there's certainly a large amount of extra pressure potentially and extra work to do if you're a product manufacturer versus a pure distributor. And I think certainly if we go through our clients, most MGA's ambition is really to become that product manufacturer. So we're taking a grip of our underwriting, we're taking a grip of product design. We want to design something that's of value to our clients, and that means being that manufacturer. So potentially there's a lot of work to do. Some firms are already there in terms of selling their stall out as that, but the first step is to decide which camp are we in. I guess many MGAs are already starting to implement things like product governance committees or conduct committees, product oversight committees, things like that, whereby there's an infrastructure already in place looking at how products are being developed. We tend to see that more on the larger end of the scale, where there is a bigger governance structure in place around those products being developed. That's not to say that in smaller operations they're not doing absolutely everything they need to do in terms of the thought process of designing products. So I see it more as a codification of how you're going about your normal business in considering what your clients really want, how can you best serve them through the design of that product. And it seems to me that most of the product governance content in the ID is really hard coding or codifying that process that you're already going through. But we'll go on to some of the differences and actually the things that may have an impact on you. So I've been slightly lazy here and cribbed this just directly from the consultation paper. And normally that makes me cringe when I'm doing presentations and see people just to recognise the text. But actually, we didn't say it at the start, but the consultation paper is actually pretty straightforward to read. It's not that long. It's easy to get through. So I've just taken this in terms of what are the FCA expecting in terms of a product governance structure. So maintain and operate a review process for existing products, significant adaptions. Most MGAs are doing that activity, so it's operating and reviewing on an ongoing basis, specifying a target market. Well, hopefully most people are doing that already. Ensuring the relevant risks of that market are assessed. So we now start to get into a bit more of an interesting area where, is the product covering all of those risks that that particular target client has? If it isn't, are we making the distributor of the product aware of the limitations of the product? How do we know that the distributor of the product understands those limitations? We start to get into the process of documenting that and understanding it and demonstrating that assessment starts to get a bit tricky. Documenting your distribution strategy and why you're going down one strategy rather than another. Again, most people have inherently thought about that in terms of how to get the product to market, but it's again codifying that. Taking reasonable steps to ensure that it's actually getting to the right market. So as an MGA or as a cover holder, if you are removed from the end sales process to a degree, that's probably not good enough anymore. You need to have some degree of oversight or understanding of how that product is ending up with your client. The end client, sorry. It goes on. Regularly review the products, at least to ensure that it remains consistent with the needs of the target market and the distribution strategy remains effective. Again, I think in many cases, the ongoing monitoring of the product, things get updated over time, they get adapted, they change of limits, change of wording. That can happen on the fly and not necessarily, again, get captured and the rationale for those changes recorded. And again, making sure that there's a distribution of information through the distribution chain to allow the end distributor or the end advisor to understand those changes and why they were put in place. And in some cases that happens, but we've seen instances where effectively firms have no actual means as an MGA of communicating the detail of the product and the intended use of the product to the end user. You've got to make available appropriate information and product approval processes to distributors. So the interesting bit here for me was the product approval process and how do you communicate that approval process down to the distributors. So you've got to almost say, this is our internal process for approving this particular product. This is why we think it's fit for purpose. And effectively hand that over to the distributors of your product for them to understand and ensure that they know the product has been through that approval process and therefore is fit for purpose to distribute. So there's equally with this last bullet, firms that distribute the product, i.e. that they don't manufacture, i.e. the retail broker has to understand what's going on further up the distribution chain in terms of the design of product. So to me it seems though there's quite a lot of communicating going on there between product manufacturer, product distributor. How do we overcome that communication in terms of product approval, product design? There's some thinking to do. So that was whistle-stop tour through 3 key topics, in our view. There are a huge number of areas covered by the IDD. The later policy statements and the later consultation papers give an insight into MiFID II and the lessons learned there and how they apply to the insurance market. There's some really interesting stuff in there in terms of the direction of travel. So I guess the key thing is to ensure that there's somebody in your business who has this firmly on their radar, but has a responsibility for understanding it. And I'd say because of the nature of it, because some of the changes could be fundamental, say to your business model, to your systems, to the way you interact with your distribution chain, and the kind of things that you need to communicate about your business, that needs to be done at a fairly senior level if there are going to be knock-on impacts like that. It doesn't just touch on one piece of the business. It's not going to be able to be implemented just by doing a quick policy wording change or a quick TOBA change. There's potentially some fundamental thinking to do. As always, once the IDD is digested within the business, starting with the governance structure, so your internal policies, training, remuneration structures, which Paul was talking about, it's remuneration of your staff as well as how you as a business get remunerated. And I think there's actually a section in there specifically about staff remuneration, and we'll need to potentially disclose that as well if you've got any conflicts. And of course, culture. So embedding the IDD within all of that gets you some way there. One of the things that we found very helpful and has sort of gone off the FCA's sort of radar is the regulatory business plan. And by that I mean setting out all of the remuneration structures and operations that you have. How do you actually conduct your business? What are the remuneration structures? Going through them one by one and identifying whether there's any conflicts, looking at mitigating factors, and then concluding on it. So you end up with effectively a register of how you trade, and it's very easy to demonstrate. Here we go. This is how I know I haven't got any conflicts. And the other thing I think is essential in terms of part of the implementation process, part of embedding this into your business is doing some testing. Paul and I did a talk a couple of weeks ago on this, linking back to the wholesale review, and we talked about the bluefin fine quite a bit. And it's quite interesting there that the FCA or the enforcement team effectively commented in their paper on it that the policies and procedures that bluefin had in place were pretty good. They were really robust, and yet they weren't followed. So they ended up with a huge fine, having the right concept at the top, but it just wasn't followed on by the frontline staff. So in testing, get to the front line and really understand what's going on there at the coalface, whether it's files, reviews, looking at trends in placement, checking your own policies and procedures and making sure that what's on paper is happening in reality, and talking to the frontline staff. Quite often we do, whether it's through our audit process or cover hold audits, things like that, where we are ending up talking to frontline staff. That's where we tend to find out quite a lot of our issues that we find is just talking to people that are doing the day-to-day rather than the compliance team or the finance team. You get a different perspective, so I always think that's pretty handy. So, getting on with IDD implementation in your own business, but also thinking about the distribution network and the whole of the chain and how that might impact on your business. So for MGAs, we've got on one hand carriers who are automatically product manufacturers. They have their own responsibilities. Your sub-brokers will have their own responsibilities, and understanding how you sit within the chain is pretty important. So, hopefully we've achieved some learning objectives. I think you know what the IDD is when it's coming in, so it's October this year. We've talked through effectively these key concepts. There are many more, so don't just focus on these. There's a number of interesting, across the whole of I think there's 3 consultation papers and 2 policy statements. The front sections of each of those are pretty quick to get through, but there's a lot in there. And hopefully you've got some practical steps of how to move forwards. So that's all I have to say. Open to questions.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Paul. Any questions from the floor? All right, while you're thinking, I'm going to throw one at Paul. In your presentation, you were talking about the basis, the source of remuneration, very much on the regulators' radar, and they're looking at where this is coming from. And in previous presentation you did, I threw VAT on the table, not for this presentation, and one of your colleagues, Lino, responded very well on that one. One thing I'd like to know, it's sort of a double-part question here for you. Some insurers give intermediaries, and I'll use that word, a marketing budget. Where would the marketing budget sit within this remuneration disclosure package? And then looking at our own terms of business agreements with our producing brokers. In a previous life at BIBA, it was agreed that the client could ask the question on how much do we earn. Am I right in saying that the IDD brings us up front and centre, so we need to revisit our terms of business agreements, stating clearly the process behind the remuneration that we as MGAs receive?
Yes, that's right. In terms of your first question about the marketing budget, I think the IDD is very specific that the amount of remuneration and the type of remuneration and basis of remuneration relates merely to the actual policy that's been written. So I wouldn't have thought that the marketing budget would come into that at that point in time. It is something that I think that the FCA within the wholesale market review would certainly be extremely interested in knowing about.
And the terms of business agreements?
Difficult to say at the moment. I would have thought that once the IDD has been properly implemented, there would be a leaning towards more disclosure within the TOBAs, yeah.
Thank you for that. Any questions from the floor? John's waiting for a question. Yes, gentlemen at the front. You have to shout.
I'll shout out. It's around the best interest of the customer. So,
right.
When they're talking about a customer, are they talking about the customers as a whole, or each individual customer? Because there might be an example where you could save all the customers as a whole some money, but one or two customers can be disadvantaged and paying more. So when they're talking about, say, best interest of the customer, what are they focused on? Everyone as a whole or everyone individually?
I think it's the individual customer.
So each customer, if one of them is disadvantaged, all of the rest will save a lot of money. So you can't move to that new market. You have to protect each customer individually. So all of the rest of them can be worse off, but one can be better.
Effectively. Yep.
It's actually a very, very interesting question that you just raised there. John, during your presentation on governance, one of the areas which you actually lifted from the consultation document talked about develop a distribution strategy consistent with the target market. If I remember right, 15.7, the outsourcing July 2015 outsourcing consultation, looked at that specific issue where it was felt that if there was a longer than average chain, and just for the audience, I had lots of arguments with the regulator. You cannot compare that of a direct writer with that of an intermediary chain. They're two fundamentally different things. With the intermediary chain, where there may be one or maybe two additional partners in there, it's knowing the customer, and the actual outsourcing consultation was looking at triggers such as MTA, such as early cancellation, such as repudiations of claims. Is the IDD building upon that, or just bringing that expectation effectively into the rules and regulations?
Yeah, I think it's codifying that, and I think it's prompting people to really think about what they're doing throughout the distribution chain, and just going back to the customer's best interests. You've got to think about that end customer rather than say, well, I'm 3 steps removed from that, so my job is to get it to the next person in the chain. Well, no, you've got to think about the end customer. So, I mean, I always use this example. I was buying a new car 3 or 4 years ago, and the person in the sales, in the showroom or whatever, was talking to me, and you get to the end and they're trying to sell you all this other stuff. And I still remember it now. The guy said to me, the FCA requires me to ask you whether you want gap insurance. Those were his words. And I said, are you sure you mean that? And he was like, yeah, I'm required by the FCA to ask you whether you want gap insurance. And it's a perfect example of the product manufacturer of the gap insurance would top themselves or something if they knew those were the words that were being used to distribute that product. So it's a great example of understanding how the product's being distributed throughout the chain and how it's being used. And I think going back to your question, Peter, the IDD is codifying that process of understanding what's going on through the whole chain. So you can't just deal with your bit properly. You have to think about the whole thing, how it gets to the end user.
That actually is a very, very good analogy because, again, we've had situations within the IDD, there is now a requirement with regard to training. Now, we know it's been watered down. It's, 15 hours, isn't it? Initially, when it was first coming out, certain people with vested interests were saying, well, you can't do it internally, guys. You've got to do it externally, and we can come along and provide that for you. So it's basically making sure that, yes, we have to do it. We have to do it appropriately. And the biggest issue, it's not written down, it's not happened. But it doesn't mean that we've got to go and get somebody else to come and do it if we are competent to do it internally. So that's a very good point, John. Ladies and gentlemen, come on. It's your session. Any more questions? Any question from the floor? It's quite interesting when we talk about the way the market tries to move. I don't know if you picked up yesterday, BIBA and the ABI have come together to write some protocols with regard to dual pricing. It's probably only taken about 15 years to get that kicking off. At least the market's moving that way, and I think the regulator will be quite pleased with that. So we've just got to watch that with a lot of interest. Any questions? Okay, what I'll do then, it's 10 to 2. We'll close this early. John, Paul, thank you very much indeed for a very thought-provoking presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please show your usual appreciation to my colleague?